Good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Ogden, and I'd like to welcome everyone watching to the sixth and final in this ongoing series of live Friday broadcasts from LaRouchePAC.com featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. As we stand here 3 days after the presidential elections, I'm sure that everyone watching tonight is highly anticipating hearing what Mr. Lyndon LaRouche has to say. We will be following the same format that we've proceeded according to in the previous broadcasts, but I also encourage you, if you do have a question during the broadcast, please send it in to the email account. We do have somebody monitoring that account tonight, and we can take that into account in the dialogue proceedings. But before we get to that, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche has some opening remarks that he has to make, and without further ado, I give you Mr. LaRouche.
Well, actually, this is not the end of this process. It will be continued in a certain different form every Friday in the coming period. We've come into a point where the Obama administration and the outgoing or not successful Republican candidate and Obama have had the same rotten, stupid policy, which, unless they've changed that, is what they will do. But I do not discount the possibility of their changing their line under the current conditions. What's going to happen is that both parties, in going into the final period of the campaign, had committed themselves to a program of supporting business interests or the equivalent of business interests at the expense of the rest of the economy. Now, when we consider the fact of that actual productive work has collapsed to a minimum in the U.S. economy, that people may be employed, but they're employed with make work, not really productive work. And that's a key problem. But, with a business-oriented only kind of thing, it means that a terrible thing will happen to the U.S. economy and its people if either of these were to be elected. Now, one has been chosen, Obama, as to be the next president of the United States as well as the present one. And that would be a catastrophe, considering the fact that Europe already is in a process approaching breakdown, a general breakdown crisis of Western and Central Europe as a result of hyperinflation already in progress there. It hasn't reached the full hyperinflation, but it's that. For example, Spain is almost out of business. Portugal is in distress. Italy is in jeopardy, and Greece is being murdered. And these are only typical of what's happening in Europe right now. And what will happen in the United States is typified by what happened in New York City, but also the adjoining regions of that section, where people are still dying of the errors made by in particular, the Obama administration. Because what's happening is that the losses of life and losses of conditions of life in the New York City and adjoining areas, as is New Jersey and so forth, that these conditions are genocidal conditions. And the Obama administration, which has just been reconfirmed, is committed to an austerity program under which there will be no effective relief for the New York City as it had existed before, or the nearby New Jersey area under the present times. So that's where we are. We're in a catastrophe. Now, what's important about this presentation today and about the presentations that we made in a different form but the same thing in the coming weeks on the same schedule is we're going to deal with the fact that not that we're going to qualify what has happened. I've already just said that. I've got to qualify what is about to happen. And that's one of my specialties, in determining what is about to happen in the economy, which is something that neither the president nor his recent rival have any competence in dealing with. And that's the issue. So what we're dealing with is Obama, who is actually a puppet of Tony Blair, the British Tony Blair. It was Blair that ushered Obama into the presidency as his protege. It's Blair who has been continually advising Obama on his policy. And it's Blair who is the chief architect of the worst things that are happening in the entire transatlantic community. For example, you may recall that there was a case came up where Blair was key in it, where he insisted that there were secret weapons in Iraq which were going to be deployed, and therefore that the United States and other powers in Europe had to start a second war in Iraq. I was involved in that with British officials in certain capacities in discussing this matter. And we determined that there was no justification in terms of these super weapons that Iraq was going to start such a war. And Iraq never did start such a war, in fact. And the war went on and on and on. And not only did it destroy Iraq up into the time of the Obama administration, not only did it do that, but it created the situation for the entire blow-up of the Middle East itself, including what happened in North Africa. So this is the man. Now this fellow is a very significant figure, representing the British Empire, and believe me, friends, the British Empire still exists. It's, for example, did you ever hear of the Saudi British Empire, the Saudi American British Empire, which gave you 9/11, the first 9/11, and gave you a second one in part in what you've just seen in North Africa and is continuing now. So that this same Blair, Tony Blair, who is guilty of a fraudulent creation of war involving the United States and other forces in a war which was totally illegal and based on a fraud. And this war, this fraud, which was orchestrated by Tony Blair, is the actual providence under which Obama came into office. And that has been his character all the way through. Now, technically Obama is supposedly committed to an austerity budget. There's no doubt he will try to do that. What will happen down the line may be different. Now, this is the issue. This is the issue that's going to carry into the coming weeks and the coming years. That you cannot predict what's going to happen on the basis of the past. And we're in a period which is typical of that. You cannot forecast what the future of the United States or Europe is going to be based on the past record. Now, the problem is that most forecasters in the United States and elsewhere on economic forecasting have been failures. None of them has been competent in forecasting, actual forecasting, because what they do is they look at statistics and take the statistical patterns which they read from the past and apply those statistical patterns to forecast what they predict will be the future. That does not work. That would work on animals. It does not work on human beings. The human species is entirely different than any other species we know of existing in this universe. There may be something out there somewhere that we don't know about, but no living species on this planet can be compared directly to the people of the United States or the people of Europe. The human species is the only species that has a voluntary capability to reshape the future by making decisions or discoveries and decisions concerning discoveries which could never be predicted on the basis of the past. It's the introduction of new principles, willful new principles by mankind, which are responsible for the entire progress of the human species. And it's that kind of what we call creativity, which is unique to the human species, which is the only competent way in which we can have foresight of what the probable developments will be down the line. Now we now have the defeated Republican candidate. We have Obama back and still in office, and renewed in office if nothing happens to his career. And most people out there, including the so-called specialists, have, as usual, in my entire experience in forecasting, which goes back to the 1950s, that in every case, including that case, exactly the opposite happened to what every statistical forecaster projected. In fact, in that case, in the January or February of that year, the auto industry collapsed exactly and on the date that I said it would collapse. And everyone in my rivals in the business at that time, the consulting period, this time, was wrong. And I was right. Now, I'll give you another case of a guy who was right. It's rather interesting because it's important to our case. Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was a young genius. His father was some kind of a genius, if you know about the history of his father's role in the Civil War. And Douglas became what he was, and he went into World War I as U.S. in France against Germany in that period. And he was a genius. He rose from colonel to a high-ranking general in terms of esteem in the short period of his career in France, because he always was able to outflank the German forces, who were more numerous than the forces at his disposal. This came up later, and came up famously in the later part of his career, after the brilliant work he did in organizing the defense of the Pacific Ocean against Japan. He also, at Incheon in Korea, and I'll take the case what he did there. Now, and this was a case where he stood alone against all his military colleagues on making a decision to go into the Incheon Inlet in order to outflank the entire North Korean overrunning of virtually the entirety of what we call South Korea today. He was the only one that did it, and did it over the opposition of every one of his officers and every other advisor. And he won. So therefore, Truman at the first shot had him thrown out of office for that reason. Then what came into office at that time, in the same period, in this different later phase of the war, in the Korean War, is that a man who had been trained under MacArthur, Eisenhower, began to campaign for the presidency of the United States on withdrawing the U.S. forces out of the Korean War. And this continued. Now, it continued in such a form that when we came to the late 1950s, the same thing happened, is that the bright people, including Charles de Gaulle, as well as others, great commanders, and men of foresight and insight, who have insight into the future, which is a natural potential of the human being. But unfortunately, because of the way our culture is run, we do not condition people to become creative. We condition them to learn how to behave as instructed. And that means that all forecasting, generally, general forecasting done by nations and groups within nations, most groups within nations, are flat wrong. Because what they do is they use statistical projections based on recent, past, and earlier experience, and presume that statistics will show them exactly what the result is. And it never does. Now we've come to a point, another forecast. The recent storm, which hit New York, New Jersey, and so forth, Sandy. Now, this thing is still going on. The death rate from Sandy is still in progress in New York City, in New York City areas. And nothing has been done, or nothing ever will be done as it stands now under this administration. Nothing ever will be done to restore the city of New York and adjoining areas. Nothing. And Obama has made that very clear as his intention. There will be no funding. Now, what the other side of this thing? Again, forecasting. We had a case of forecasting in Louisiana, where they had built a buffer system necessary to defend that whole coastal area against a major flood. We had Rhode Island had faced a similar threat and had acted to build a buffer, as had been done in the Bay in Louisiana. But the other side of the thing is, earlier, George Bush II, when the dynasty, George II had blocked the development of the defenses, the bulwark defenses, for the Louisiana area. And the great system, the protective system that now protects Louisiana's coast, was put in as a result of the incompetence of the Bush administration. And so the problem has been constantly that when people forecast it, will say, no, that is not a necessary thing to do. When scientific information has indicated it is a necessary thing as a precaution. Now, what's happened now in the case of Sandy, the destruction in New York City and about joining areas will never fully be restored as long as Obama is president. That's the forecast. And that's the price that was paid because we didn't listen to the forecasters, we listened to the financial advisors. And that's what has happened, and that's what's happening now. So therefore, if Obama falls into his track as his track record now, we are not going to ever restore New York City and adjoining areas to what it had been over years before. And this is a decision made so far by Obama, the current president of the United States, and apparently the future one. Similar kinds of things. So these kinds of things, and the great one is the great New York Times, which I sometimes refer to as the Slimes, if you know some of my experience with that little organ. They are in the lead. They are now praising all the good things that are supposedly happening in the New York general area when there's nothing but really net loss and death guaranteed by President Obama, who has said that the funds for this will never be done. Now, if the bulwark, which was scheduled for New York City, which the mayor and others of New York City refused to consider, had been used, the cost of that bulwark would be a small fraction of the cost which we're going to incur without profit, without benefit from New York City now. And people this day are still dying because they are still in places, apartments and so forth, where they have no access to anything. And the natural conditions of loss of food and conditions of life in those places, especially for older people, they're dying. How many, I don't know. But it's going on. The death has not stopped. And the New York Times is still spreading filth of denial in dealing with this. So the issue before us, the issue which you face now, after the election, is, are you going to continue to cave in to authorities which have proven themselves to be of this character? Are you going to rely on people who make forecasts which are intrinsically incompetent from the outset? Not forecasts that are mistaken, but forecasts and guarantees which are intrinsically incompetent from the outset. All right, so now we're coming into what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to have an insight into what the forecast is for the future, not the usual forecast for the past. It's a little kind of funny thing there. The hindcast, they call it a forecast when it's actually a hindcast. They don't apparently know whether they're coming or going. All right, so this is the issue. Now we all are facing now conditions which, in terms of the press, in terms of many forecasters or forecasting agencies, the people don't know what they're talking about or are neglecting it. For example, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are, as of now, unless they change their opinion, as of now are going to cause a great disaster throughout the U.S. economy. The greatest disaster you can imagine. Now we already have millions of Americans who should be employed, who are hopeless. We have other Americans who are employed, but they're employed in make-work jobs, not really productive jobs, not ways that are going to improve the economy of the United States. And that's not bad in a sense, because giving them jobs and paying them is better than starving them to death, of course. But they're not getting much better than that right now. Now, health care. They've cut in health care, which Obama demands, and which the Republicans do not oppose. That health care will be a killer. That health care policy. It'll be a mass killer. And when you take the depth at which the mass cuts are going to take in these categories, you're going to have a death rate in the United States produced by the forecasts made by presidents and their candidates. So therefore, you have to be concerned about the future. You have to find a way to understand what the future means now in the coming several years even. And it's going to be a terrible future unless you change it. And that's what our problem is now. And that's what we have to pay attention to. So my job here and in related functions is to continue my function as a forecaster. And as many people know from, say, the 1971 experience, for example, and certain other experiences, my forecasting has always worked. Now, that doesn't mean I've forecasted everything that happened. It means that when I committed myself to a forecast, it was right on the terms I specified. And in a case like 1971, in summer 1971, I was the only one who knew this and had forecast this as early as 1968. And we had argued this issue about what was going to happen in 1968 on. And it happened in 1971 as I said it would happen, in the period I estimated it would happen. So that is simply an example of the fact that forecasting is possible. Competent forecasting is possible. And forecasting means, what do we have to do to solve the threats which are innate in the situation we face? Now, at present, Western and Central Continental Europe is in the process of dying. That is, if the trend and policy trends which are established in the Euro area, so-called, in Europe, are allowed to continue, the area will die. These former nations, and I say former nations, Portugal, a former nation, Spain, a former nation, France, a former nation, Germany, a former nation, Italy, a former nation, Greece, a former nation, and so forth. These nations, or former nations, are now faced with distress at an unbelievable rate of acceleration of inflation, which is going to cause mass death unless it's stopped. We face a similar situation in the United States, but different. We face a similar situation in much of the world. The green policy, which has been developed since essentially the 1960s, the Greenie policy, which began to take over once we had assassinated our president at the time. And therefore, if we don't change these policies, if we don't recognize what's wrong with them, we're not going to make it. There has to be a change in direction. We cannot accept, and no sane person who's responsible can accept the policy of the Republican Party as stated during the recent campaign. No sane person, unless they're stupid, could accept the policy of austerity which the Obama administration is determined to carry forth immediately. These are mass murderous policies. This negligence, this policy. Now, the point is, on top of this, Obama and the Republicans, in their policy for austerity, are also stupid as well as evil. That's a very funny combination, isn't it? Because they're stupid because they don't understand and don't wish to understand what an economy is and what makes it. When you have a collapse, a hyperinflationary accelerating collapse in Western Europe, Western and Central Europe, and in the United States, and you want to reduce employment to business employment, what are you? A clown or a murderer? But that's what you've got. The Republicans came into this campaign as damn fools, and Obama was worse. The whole process was... Now, what's the responsibility here? What's our responsibility as mankind? What's my duty as a person, as a citizen? What's my duty? My duty is to prevent this thing from happening. My duty is to use my knowledge, my ability to forecast, to win a war, as MacArthur was a real winner, not with his fists, but with his mind, as he showed throughout his career. And our job is to find leaders in this nation who will function with their mind, not their fists or their brute ambition. We have to recognize that money has no intrinsic value. How can you talk about the intrinsic value of money when you have hyperinflation is escalating in Europe and also in the United States? You're talking about money? You say that money represents value? Money does not represent intrinsic value, never did. Money's just a means of exchange. We don't have any measure of value in this case. Value is the ability of mankind, essentially, to continue to survive and to progress in that survival. Mankind is the only creative species that we know of on this planet. The only species that can willfully increase its power as a species to develop the planet and beyond. Now, we've got to come to a point where you have not only all the needs on the planet, you've got some other problems, which are not much spoken of, but they're right here now. There is a change in process within the nearby parts of the solar system. And this change in process means that we're getting more and more risk of having parts of our planet knocked out by various little pieces of asteroids heading down on planet. And it doesn't take much. I mean, one small piece actually can take out the whole Bay Area of California or area of New York or other areas of that type. So we're facing a threat to humanity. Now, this threat to humanity goes beyond everything that these guys are talking about. If any of these people, including the Obama administration or the Republicans, had any brains at all, they would know that Obama was worse than a damn fool for cutting NASA. Because if we are threatened, as we are, by asteroids and things like that, which are cutting through the orbit of the Earth at all times, and can at any unlucky time can hit the Earth itself. And they do hit the Earth repeatedly. It's usually very small pieces which get burned up in the atmosphere, or something which is minor in terms of its collision. But we also have been faced, and leading scientists of the United States have recognized this danger since the late part of the 1970s and early 1980s, that the importance of defense of Earth against asteroids and similar kinds, and comets, which can be also extremely deadly. We have no significant defense against these threats. Now, the best thing we have here on this is we sent a recent Curiosity installation into Mars. Now, that's not going to solve the problem, but it represents the kind of action which has to be taken on a higher level than Curiosity itself in order to deal with some of this problem. Because it's only by the degree that we can operate from Mars to Earth and build up a system of defense, first of all, to locate where these rocks are, to intersect them, deflect them so they will not hit Earth. They'll pass through the orbit of Earth, but we will deflect them. And that may take several years to do. You start to push this thing some years ahead, and you have pushed it out of the way of Earth by the time they come into that pattern. And that's one of there are other things. We can blow these things up and fragment them, and they become less dangerous. But the point is we've got to do it. Now, when Obama shut down much of NASA, Obama condemned a lot of human beings to potential nasty death. That's not a very patriotic or very president-like action. We need more than NASA. We need the complete restoration of NASA, and also further measures which enable us to identify these rocks. And we don't even know where 90% of these rocks are within this space between the Mars orbit and the Venus orbit. And we have to find that out. Scientists have been employed in studying this matter for some time, for now about 30 years. But we still are making little progress because we need to actually get out. That doesn't mean we're going to put people on Mars, but we're going to put instruments on Mars, and we're going to build instruments and deliver them there, which will be useful to us in isolating these threats for a defense of Earth. Now, my operation in this connection goes back to the 1970s, when I got involved in precisely this question, to my concern about defense against nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons. And that led me into playing a rather significant role at one point in developing a defense system, a space-based defense system against various kinds of man-made and other threats. So that technology has been in progress, but very little progress over the coming years. One of our presidents took a very serious view of this matter and did support it. Others have supported it. But we now have to realize that we are not limited in our problems to those problems which exist within the confines of Earth itself. We are also threatened by these other conditions for which we are doing very little or almost nothing. And we must. This means that we have to go beyond the limited science we apply to Earth problems, and we must now go to a higher level of science which concedes those problems we have to deal with in terms of the nearby area within our solar system. And that is one of the objectives. But we have nothing going now, in general, on this planet, especially in Europe and especially in the Americas. We have nothing going now which really is addressing not only the kinds of new problems which we face on Earth, as we should see from the weather problem, the Sandy, which is a new problem and portends other problems of that nature. We're not even doing that. But we also have to plan now, because it's going to take some years to develop the kinds of systems necessary to prepare for a defense of Earth against this great mass of mostly unknown, but known to exist, satellites. And that's where we have to go. Therefore, the important thing now, okay, the current president of the United States is utterly incompetent. that he's not competent to perform his function in leading the defense of the nation or the defense of the planet. He's not competent because he sabotaged the little things we did have in terms of NASA, the little things we did have, which were the basis for actually developing a defense against these kinds of problems. He's not willing to put anything into that, just as he's not willing to put anything into preventing something like what happened to New York City, Jersey, and so forth in Sandy. And therefore, what these concerns, and those of us who have these concerns, unlike this president and his rival, those of us who have these concerns must continue to build in private and in public, build for the support of the things that are needed to defend this nation, to defend this planet's life, and to defend this nation against the dangers from nearby planets. These are missions that we must take on now. And we will be doing this every week, as we've been doing it during the period of this campaign. We will be dealing with this problem and related problems. And we will present our insights and our solutions, and I can say fairly my special capabilities and skills in order to defend this nation, this planet, and the future of humanity. Thank you.